Good afternoon, everybody. I am Tom Fontana, Director of Research and Education with the Ohio Soybean Council. The Ohio Soybean Council is the soybean checkoff organization for the state of Ohio. And as such, our board decides what kind of projects should be funded to support the profitability of soybean farmers in Ohio and their ability to continue to farm over the long term. And in around 2011, 2012, long before the Toledo water crisis changed things dramatically in the state of Ohio, our board decided there were a number of issues that needed to be addressed in Ohio. Our board was interested in a number of areas. Research, felt like there was a lack of research in certain areas around water quality and nutrient management. Interested in education and communication, especially to farmers, and advocacy. I'm not going to talk about advocacy today. That's the job of the Ohio Soybean Association. As your checkoff organization in Ohio, we are not allowed to use checkoff dollars to fund lobbying or advocacy efforts. So I'm going to concentrate primarily on research and education. So I mentioned around 2011, 2012, our farmers got very interested in the issue of algae blooms on Lake Erie and nutrient management and water quality. And it was apparent we didn't know a lot of things. We didn't know how much phosphorus was actually leaving the field, why it was leaving the field, what BMPs were best for keeping phosphorus on the field. And we realized that the fertilizer recommendations at that point were approaching 20 years old. So, edge of field research was the first thing that our board sponsored at the Ohio State University. That was a joint effort of the Ohio State University and USDA. That program started in 2012, and we were looking to answer some of those questions that I mentioned a minute or so ago. So we wanted to evaluate the on-field conditions and try to figure out why nutrients were leaving the field, especially phosphorus. And the phosphorus index that NRCS uses to, when you get grant funds from NRCS, needed updating. And the criteria used in that P-risk index weren't really viable anymore. So funding came from us at the Ohio Soybean Council, and then we were joined by the Ohio Corn and Small Grains Marketing Group, Checkoff, Ohio Farm Bureau contributed, the Andersons, Pioneer, and many other stakeholders, too numerous to mention. And then that was followed up with a $1 million grant in matching funds from NRCS. So this tool has been developed. It's pretty much ready for prime time. It's a P-risk tool. It's called On-Field Ohio. It's for use by farmers, CCAs, whomever, and it can give you an assessment of how much phosphorus will leave the field when you're using specific management practices. And it can be done on a field-by-field basis. And it allows farmers and advisors to help make decisions about what BMPs will work best for keeping phosphorus on the farm field. It is confidential. All the information is confidential. And there's a provision to upload shape files into this, which should be helpful to those of you who might want to use it. We've also supported and educated folks about the 4R Nutrient Stewardship Program. I think most of you are familiar with that. Run by the Ohio Agribusiness Association. And these are some numbers of the number of facilities certified and the total number of acres that are covered by that. We've done a variety of education and outreach, and we've worked with a variety of partners on getting out information on management practices and water quality issues in the state. We've provided outlets for increasing farmer knowledge, work with OSU Extension extensively, their workshops, field days, newsletters, and other materials. We've worked closely with the Ohio Federation of Soil and Water Conservation Districts on getting information out. There is a new best management practices manual that is available from Ohio State, but that was a grant that the Soybean Council received from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation of around $370,000 to prepare that manual and to get the information out about it out in the Western Lake Erie Basin. So it was the Soybean Council working with OSU Extension, the Ohio Federation of Soil and Water Conservation Districts with funding from NFWF. You know about the certification programs that are out there, fertilizer certification, and I already mentioned the 4R program. And I'm here at the No-Till conference. And there's a lot of web-based information out there as well. We try to promote precision farming activities that'll help with this issue. Most of you are aware of what's available out there as far as precision farming technology and so forth. It has become apparent, and it's probably pretty obvious to most of you, that fertilizer incorporation is awfully important when you're working with phosphorus. Getting in touch with the soil is critical. I mentioned education. We have worked with farmers on all the information that's available on this. We're also interested in a number of other things. Verification is a big issue. How do you determine whether how you're making progress? So you need a baseline of information to start from, and then you need to monitor changes in practices and how that has helped the situation particularly in the Western Lake Erie Basin. So we're working with economists and other groups, working with the Fertilizer Institute and the United Soybean Board to gather information. We've also been in touch with the Nature Conservancy to gather information on this, and it's proving to be difficult, but it's very, very important if we're going to be able to substantiate the fact that farmers are doing things that are improving the situation. As Steve mentioned, he arrived, actually, our board funded Steve before he even came to Ohio. First time I talked to him was he was in California still. And our board was very interested in updating the fertilizer recommendations. So they approved funding to get the project started, and Steve came shortly thereafter, and we've been working for a number of years, and you'll hear from him in a few minutes about this. Along with the Ohio Corn and Wheat folks, we have been the major funder of this work. We felt that we needed up-to-date fertilizer recommendations, and it was very important. And so we hope that this information, you'll hear about it today, but we hope it's pretty much rolled out in the next month or so. And that Steve will talk about this. These are the kinds of things he did. While he was out in the field, he collected a lot of other information that was helpful for other faculty members and so forth on, did tissue testing and grain yields and looking for pests out in the field and so forth, all which are important to soybean farmers. So, in general, farmers want to do the right thing. They want to be good environmental stewards. We know farmers continually adapt their practices to improve the situation, improve water quality. We feel that decision making should be based on best science and research available. And we are actively participating in research projects and funding through a variety of farmer organizations. And there are still questions that need to be answered, and some of those are these. Some of these actually are being talked about here at the conference this week. For example, the first one, legacy pea and farmland. There are some farms out there that have very, very high phosphorus levels, and there is work being done to try to figure out how much they contribute to the issue. And, trying to figure out how much surface drainage versus tile drainage contribute to the issue of phosphorus leaving the farm field. There's still work being done on that. Another question is how much of the particulate phosphorus that leaves the surface of your farm field ends up getting dissolved once it gets into the waterways. We're looking at that. Nitrogen can help fuel the toxicity of algae blooms. Phosphorus helps them grow, but nitrogen can help the toxic part of the issue of microcystin, so that needs to be looked at. Fertilizer placement, I think, has pretty much been resolved that placement is critical. And then we have the heavy rain events to deal with. Research pretty much shows that the heavy rain events are very, very big contributors to this issue. So, with that, I will turn it over to Steve. I thank you for your time today. On behalf of Ohio soybean farmers, we appreciate your participating in the conference today, and we look forward to working on projects that will help you out in the future.
Thank you, Tom. I think it's easy for us to take some of the work that's being done for granted, and I think that it's very important to recognize the leaders in terms of what we're doing as an ag community for water quality, right? And part of this message or part of this outlook is about controlling the narrative, and in particular, when we come to water quality, and there's a lot of people interested, and a lot of people that might not know very much about agriculture or how things are done, and so I think this is a really important piece of that process of controlling the narrative. And so I'm excited to share kind of some of the stuff that we found. Okay, so I'm going to spend maybe just about 30 or 40 minutes talking a little bit about these on-farm strip trials and other long-term P&K trials. The year was 1995. Think back to what you were doing in 1995. Well, pop culture, one of my father's favorite feature movies, Braveheart, might be a personal favorite, was released. O.J. Simpson was on trial. Brad Pitt was named the sexiest man alive. Good for him. This little website named Amazon.com sold its first book. But all that, of course, is overshadowed by the release of the Tri-State Fertilizer recommendation. A household name across the country, even in great states like Iowa and Kentucky. Oh, that's another. Was I born then, or was I graduating high school? Yeah. You can do the math. I graduated high school in the great year of 1995. Okay. In seriousness, there's a lot to be said. We won't cover all of this. Published in 1995, it was a industry-led effort that helped unify recommendations across this tri-state region of Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio. Okay, and it really has served as a cornerstone of fertility, how we think about nutrients, how we manage nutrients, particularly in field crops. For those of you that are unindoctrinated, let me give you a very simple analysis of how these things work as fertilizer recommendations. We have these, I'm going to switch hands because I am right-handed. We have these 3 areas of a buildup range, maintenance range, and a drawdown. The buildup is this idea that we're going to add fertilizer. So as our soil test level draws down, our fertilizer rate increases. Okay, so this is not news to many people. Essentially, when we're in this buildup range, the recommendation is to fertilize, and to fertilize beyond crop removal, because we actually want to build our soil test levels up to provide a buffer, to provide an insurance policy over time that the soil is going to supply sufficient nutrients. When we get into this maintenance range in a broad sense, we essentially, our fertilization rate becomes what we're removing with crop harvest, right? So if we're removing 50 pounds of P2O5 in grain, we're going to be applying 50 pounds of P2O5 in grain. We'll see that yield potential and actually what we're pulling off in terms of these tables that are in the tri-states are really important for fertilization rates, right? So as our yields go up, our fertilizer rates go up. And then finally, we have this drawdown range, which the fertilizer amount quickly goes to zero, but it's essentially in case you're only fertilizing every few years, it's trying to keep us in that maintenance range. So as they were written and published in 1995, the magic numbers for phosphorus are 15 to 30 Bray phosphorus part per million. That's 30 to 60 pounds per acre. For potassium, it's based on cation exchange capacity, but something roughly around 100 to 150 is our maintenance range. Okay, so again, this maintenance range is the sweet spot that the recommendations encourage growers to keep it in that range, okay, for maximum profitability. Before we get to new data, I want to think about where we've come from, right? What is the actual basis? I came here, I didn't have any experience working with P&K fertilizer in Ohio, but I wanted to know exactly what the recs were based on. My predecessor's predecessor, Jay Johnson, was here at OSU for better part of 25 years, and every year created a annual report of all the activity. Okay, so none of this is digitized, but in my office when I arrived on day one, there was a stack of these reports, essentially 25 years. This entire career was summarized in these reports. And what we did is we went back and we just looked at the data and essentially mined it. So 68 phosphorus trials, 92 potassium trials over those 25 years. And I want to just, because we're going to be talking about relative yield, I want to take a second to explain what we mean by relative yield and how essentially a lot of these fertilizer trials are conducted. Okay, so the idea is that we've got a strip, right? These on-farm strip trials, we've got a field. We might fertilize a strip with potash or with P2O5 or whatever it might be, and then we leave a strip unfertilized. We do this multiple strips. We randomize it as kind of a gold standard for trials. Then we measure yields, and our relative yield is really just the ratio of what the yield is on the unfertilized versus the fertilized. So if you're growing soybeans, and you get 45 bushel in the unfertilized and 50 in the fertilized, you multiply it by 100 and you get essentially a 90% relative yield. In other words, you get a 10% reduction if you don't fertilize. And this is really kind of the framework of how we think about and evaluate fertility, develop recommendations. What's really critical here, of course, is what that soil test level is, right? So we need to measure that and relate. We went back again and looked at Jay Johnson's data, and what we have is phosphorus trials on the left and potassium trials on the right, with soil test levels, soil test P, soil test K, and then this relative yield. Okay, so relative yield at 100%, again, if it's 100%, the fertilized and the unfertilized were exactly the same. We conclude fertilizer had no effect, right? And then we've got these dashed lines, okay? So this is, again, this at 15 part per million, that's our critical level, and roughly 100 part per million for potassium, that's our critical level. So what happens when we go below that critical level? We can see that trials are essentially unresponsive to fertilizer. As we go below that critical level, then we start to see yield responses. So up to 50% reductions or even greater than that when we don't apply fertilizer. It's important to point out that we don't always get a yield response, right? Sometimes there's things, sometimes the weather isn't good, sometimes there's a lot of other issues that we say that fertility wasn't a limiting factor in that year. So each one of these circles is essentially a unique trial that was conducted over 25 years. Okay, so I was actually quite surprised to see the data this clean. It might look like a giant mess to you, but this is kind of how recommendations are developed. And we see essentially pretty positively after we've dropped below 15 part per million for phosphorus, we're seeing yield declines and 100 for potassium, okay? So again, these are the data. The tri-states are 3 states. This is just the Ohio piece that went into here, but it's nice and it's reaffirming to see that they're grounded in what we would call, a good reason, good rationale. Okay, so I'll ask this question, what if we can just wipe the slate clean? There's a lot to consider and a lot to think about when we're developing fertilizer recommendations and how we might actually be managing nutrients. What if we just kind of threw everything out and started from a clean slate? Can we do that? And I think it's important, just to air our grievances right now, right? Like what's wrong with the tri-state recommendations that we might want to start over, might want to think about hitting the reset button, okay? So what's the first one that everyone says? It's old data, right? They're old. They're 20, 25 years old. Has anything changed in agriculture in the last 20, 25 years? A few things that I can think of, right? Quite a bit, actually. Soil test extractants are on the basis the Bray phosphorus and the ammonium acetate. Most commercial labs really don't use those anymore. Everything has moved to Malic 3. So we're based on extractants that actually commercial labs aren't using. It solely relies on build and maintenance. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Not particularly transparent about the data. If you actually go and pull the document, the PDF, you don't see a lot of data that's actually shown there. And then I would argue that there's a bit of overselling of the precision of soil testing and soil fertility. Now, we know that there's science behind this, but it's not as precise an art. If you do this in the real world, you understand that there's variability that happens. It happens at the field scale. It happens from year to year. So we need to be honest with ourselves in terms of that, okay? I'm going to talk a little bit about this later in the session, but I'll just, in case for those that aren't here or that don't stick around, we're moving, one of the outputs, one of the main changes is that we're going to be moving from Bray phosphorus to a Malic 3 phosphorus, okay? So we've done quite a bit of work in terms of relating Malic 3 versus P versus Bray P, and then Malic 3 potassium versus ammonium acetate potassium. Suffice it to say, if you want to do the conversion, you need to 1.35. Essentially, Malic extracts 35% more phosphorus than Bray. This is consistent with what a lot of commercial soil test labs do already. But if you're interested in just taking that critical range for phosphorus, 15 to 30 ppm, and just wholesaling switching it, we're now dealing with about a 20 to 40 part per million maintenance range for phosphorus in Malic 3, okay? Ammonium acetate, a lot of people treat ammonium acetate and Malic 3 potassium as one and the same. We found a little bit of difference, maybe enough to think about, maybe not. There's a lot more variability with soil test case, so I'm not sure that that's really something that we need to quibble about. Okay, now I'm going to talk about a set of experiments that I think are really, really important. And these are long-term P&K trials that Robert Mullen, my predecessor, started back in 2005 and 6. They're really at our 3 agronomy farms in Clark County at the western branch, Wood County, the northwest branch, and then in Worcester and Wayne County, okay? P&K fertilizer rates, there's 3 rates of both P&K, a true zero, a 1x, which is essentially at removal rate. So again, if we're pulling off 50 pounds of potash, we're applying 50 pounds of potash, and then a 2 to 3 time removal rate. So we're really basically applying 2 to 3 times as much as we've removed. Corn and soybean rotation. I'm going to show you soil test data. This is soil phosphorus, Malic 3, at our 3 sites, Northwest, that's that Wood County, Hoytville Clay, Western Branch, and Clark County and Worcester, okay? And so we've got 13 years right now. It started in 2006, and we've got 13 years of data looking at our red lines are the unfertilized, these light blue lines are the 1x removal, and then the blue lines are the 2 or 3x. So if you need the gory details, the first 9 years were all at 2x, and starting in 2016, we started applying at 3 times removal, okay? So what do we see? I will mention that these dashed red lines are our maintenance range, okay? So we see that there's can be quite a bit of variability depending on the site. Northwest, for whatever reason, has a lot of variability in our values. And we see over time a drop in the unfertilized and maybe a little bit of drop in the 1x or the at removal rate. This is largely consistent with what other states have found in the Midwest, okay? But the head scratcher is when we look at potassium, our potassium trends, okay? And so this is potassium, again, the exact same setup, Northwest, Western, and Worcester. In reality, because these are heavier soils, our maintenance range is really bumped up a little bit. But folks, what's happening here we're applying no fertilizer for 13 years, at removal rate for 13 years, and then twice the removal rate for 13 years. Are we seeing buildup of soil test potassium over time? Okay, it's pretty clear that's not happening. Why is that? I'm here to tell you I have absolutely no idea, but I'm happy to take any suggestions in terms of somebody telling me why this is happening. I've talked to colleagues about this. Nobody really has a clue. But it raises this point about build and maintenance. And the question is, are we fertilizing at rates to maintain soil test levels, or are we fertilizing for the purpose of seeing a crop response, right? And those might actually be different things. Tri-states as they're written now basically say that's how we should manage. But our information here, it's not particularly appealing. We think about the economics, just say in Wayne County, starting up here, applying twice removal rate, and we're ending up down here, right? That's the economics of that over 13 years. It's questionable. So I don't have a perfect take-home story for this, but it's one thing I wanted to show you. We can take the starting values in phosphorus and what we ended in 2018. We can calculate change in soil test P on a yearly basis. Essentially, we're talking about a 0.8 to 2 part per million drawdown every year when it's not fertilized, okay? So that's really not a lot. For potassium, we can do the same thing, and somewhere between 4.5 to 7.5 part per million drop without fertilization. Again, these are just looking at these unfertilized red lines. Any questions on that? Hopefully that's clear. But the question is, are we going to go from, say, 40 part per million to 20 part per million in just a couple years? And the answer, at least from the data that we have here, it's very unlikely for that to happen, okay? Let's talk about yields, okay? So again, the unfertilized did not receive fertilized. This is phosphorus trials. Again, the columns are Northwest, Western, and Worcester, corn on the top, and soybean on the bottom. And it's that same labeling scheme of red is unfertilized, 1x is the light blue, and 2 to 3x is the dark blue. There's yield variability here across the years, right? Is it driven by fertility? Is soil phosphorus, or is phosphorus fertilization a major driver of fertilizer crop response here? I would argue not a lot. Some sites like Northwest, it barely looks like there's any difference. Some sites like Western, you might see a little bit here and a little bit in Worcester. We can look at the same for potassium. looks like the same graph. I can assure you it's different data. Western branch, we see a little bit of signal here with potassium, and then it's particularly in soybeans. For whatever reason, consistently at the western branch, that soil type with soybeans seems to be very responsive for potassium. Here I would say this is really the only evidence where we have sustained, not fertilizing for 13 years, and we actually see that year after year after year hitting up, okay? So we can take this and we can run the statistics. We had, for each phosphorus, we had 3 rates of potassium, and for each potassium, we had 3 rates of phosphorus. So we get quite a bit of comparisons, a number of comparisons where we're comparing unfertilized versus fertilized, okay? We can look at our P trials, and this is really looking at the statistics, saying did fertilization statistically increase yield? We can see instances where out of 108 total comparisons where we got increases and when we got decreases with fertilizer. It happens. Fertilization does cause yield decline sometimes. Is it truly related to that fertilizer? Is it a product of random noise? Probably a little bit of both. K trials again. So you can see the numbers here. Out of 108, 19 hits with fertilizer, 10 with P, 10 with K. Out of 90 soybean trials, only 7 with P and 15 with K. So the take home here is that there's just not, 13 years of not fertilizing. Who feels comfortable doing that on their farm? Not applying P or K, and we got a few takers in the back. Okay, great. We just don't see a lot. It's a good story because it tells us that soils have the capacity, when they're in that maintenance range, to be able to supply sufficient P and K over time, okay? We're not out here recommending that you don't fertilize for 13 years, of course, but I just want to, it's good information to help underscore that thought. On the flip side, we could argue, do crops need to be spoon-fed? Do they need a little bit here and there? Every few months, do they need a little douse of something? Well, this doesn't really suggest it. Okay, so then the last thing about the yields, what we did is we took and we essentially said, let's just kind of do this from a slightly economic perspective. We simply took the fertilized treatment and subtracted the yields of the unfertilized, okay? We did that on a year-by-year basis, and then we summed it up. So how many total bushels as a difference happened with between the 1x and the 0 and the 2x and the 0? And this is total bushels over those 13 years, okay? So again, our, phosphorus trials, Northwest, Western Worcester, corn and soybean, and then potassium trials, same thing. So there's a lot to kind of take in here, but what I want to show you is that consistently across corn and soybean, when we fertilize with double removal rate, we get, on average, over those 13 years, more yield, okay? Which means I'm looking at these bars, the 2x, being bigger than this 1x bar, all right? So, however, when we come to potassium, fertilizing at 2x nearly always reduces our total yields, okay? So applying twice the potash rate then is recommended almost always, except for one scenario here where we see an actual increase applying twice. Okay, so what's the take home from this? Well, I haven't done any economics, but I can tell you that most cases here, applying twice the fertilizer, paying for twice the fertilizer over 13 years is not going to pay for the increase in bushel, okay? And in some case, you're going to actually be hurting your yields or potentially hurting your yields. And I'm just assuming that this is a salt effect, right, with that extra potash. All this was, I didn't mention this, but all this was soybean applied and typically lightly incorporated in the fall after soybean harvest. So right before that corn phase of the rotation. Questions on this? Yes, sir. Total bushels over 13 years. So we did it on a year-by-year basis and then added it across all 13 years. So, yep. Yes. I mean, that's a working hypothesis, right? I'm not sure. We haven't looked at it, but that's. I have not. No. So the ability of that. So it's an estimate of how salt tolerant that. Okay. Anybody have insight on that? Okay. Any other questions before we move on? Yes, sir. It's all conventional farming. Yes, sir. Yep. A negative response to nitrogen. Yeah, so there would have been extra nitrogen in the phosphorus trials, but not with the potash, right? For the potash trials, all the N rate was consistent across the board. So, yeah, so that wouldn't have been a factor. Okay. Let's talk about on-farm strip trials, okay? 2014 to 2018, last 5 years, we've run quite a bit, and this is like really, I need a acknowledgement slide. How many folks in the room were part of this effort in terms of running strip trials across the state? Anybody here? Okay, I see about maybe 10 hands or something like that. So a collective effort, a very large effort, and I can't say enough about that. So here's where the work was done. We had 39 total counties where we actually ran nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, or sulfur strip trials on farm, all replicated and randomized, corn, soybean, wheat. You'll notice that the tri-states do contain recommendations for alfalfa and corn silage. We have not looked at any of that to date. That's not going to be part of kind of the revision at this point. The idea was to have lots of diversity of farming types, systems, soil types, growers that use cover crops, growers that use manures, growers that didn't use any of those and just did a corn soybean rotation, et cetera, et cetera. We sampled soil, pre-fertilization, leaf tissue at R1 typically. We, of course, measured yield to see if we got a yield bump from fertilization, and then we measured nutrient concentration in the grain and did a bit of a management survey so we could understand a little bit more about the history of those sites. Okay? Here's what we ended with. There's a lot of information on this slide. I'll just walk you through it. 102 trials over 5 years. Okay, these are all on farm. 54 in corn, 48 in soybean, 34 counties for that. Our average soil test phosphorus value was somewhere about 50, somewhere 50, 55 part per million. Again, the maintenance range for Malic 3 phosphorus, 20 to 40, right? And so we can see this distribution. The majority of the farms in corn and soybean were either at or above maintenance range. We got very respectable yields, 192 bushel average for corn and 48 for soybeans, okay? So based on the tri-state RACs, thinking about all, even though we begged for low testing fields, we typically did not get them, right? And this isn't to say that, this is not, just to be clear, this is not like intended to be representative of the cropland in Ohio. It's a very, very small survey or section of that. But would we expect, given that most of the soil is at maintenance or above, to see a lot of yield response? The answer is no, not according to tri-state RECs, right? So, again, a fair amount of information here, but overall trials, we average overall trials, and I'm going to show you individual data here in a second, so just bear with me. For phosphorus, for corn, applying phosphorus fertilizer increased across all trials 3.6 bushels, okay? 3.6 bushels of corn. Typically, these rates, I should say that, some of it was starter P. Most of it was a broadcast application of P that either went on in the fall or the spring. But there's a lot of different kind of permutations of trials that are here, but all the same basic framework. The range for phosphorus, minus 20 bushel to plus 22 bushel, and what that translates to is essentially a 98 relative yield, a 2% yield reduction without fertilizer, okay? We had 8 statistically increases with P fertilization and 1 decrease, and you can see the same. It's fairly true for soybeans as well. 1.3 bushel increase across all trials, okay? Let's look at K. Again, the same idea. These values are relatively consistent. 81 trials, 33 in corn, 48 in soybeans. Average soil test K level is about 160 Malic. And again, yields similar to what we had before. Here's the distribution across this maintenance range, 100 and 150. Corn, on average, increased potassium fertilization, increased corn yields across these 33 trials, 3.9 bushels, okay? With quite a big range of minus 44 to 58 bushels. But soybeans, look at this. On average, fertilizing soybeans with potash across our trials gave you a whopping minus 6 or minus 0.6 bushel. Okay, so just not a lot of responses that we've seen overall. Okay, so here comes. So I'm just showing you some of the data that we have. Okay, and there's a lot of. There's plenty of story that I haven't told you about this. The on-farm trials, there's a lot of like little sub-narratives in each one of those. But what we do, because everybody wants to know what that magic number is, what's that critical level, right, for phosphorus and potassium. And so we do this thing called a Kate-Nelson analysis. And we do this, it's a statistical method that it's very common in soil fertility to kind of identify, identify what these soil test levels are, okay? So I'm going to show you some of that right now. How this works, relative yield on this axis, soil test P here. The analysis tries to minimize the points in this quadrant and the points in this quadrant. Try to maximize the points here and the points here, okay? And so we can get into that, but let's not do it for the sake. So essentially, our relative yield right here is not at 92%. We're at a 20 part per million phosphorus. This is our on station. So these are our 3 long-term P and K. We can split this down by corn and soybean. And again, it's not the prettiest data, right? But there's a lot of it. We end up for corn 22 part per million for our critical level and soybean 12 part per million. Again, this is on station. We can look at our on-farm trials now. And again, it's not... there's a lot less data because there's really just, we've got about 100 trials here. 26 part per million for a critical level for corn and 18 for soybean. Moving on to K. Again, our on-station long-term trials for K, 76 as a critical level there. We split down corn and soybean, 75 and 120 here. So we do have a little bit of evidence that soybean might be, it's not consistent with the on-farm work, but for these, the long-term stuff, soybeans tend to be a little bit more responsive to K than corn. And then again, our on-farm potash trials, 59 for a critical level. And here this one's came back at 230, but look where this relative yield is, 126. So this just indicates a really poor fit. Okay, so this is something I would call kind of an outlier, just data that don't fit that model, and we're going to kick that out. We can look on farm, corn by itself, corn, soybean, corn only, soybean only, on station, corn and soybean, da da da. Just look at these numbers that I've highlighted here. Here's our critical levels. Okay. Do we see kind of an emerging theme here? Somewhere centering around 20 part per million as a critical level for soil test P. Soil test K isn't as clear of a story, but I would argue if you look and parse through the data like I have, it's somewhere around 100 as a safe spot, maybe a little bit less than that for soil test K, Malic 3. Okay? So to wrap up, soil test levels failed to substantially build at most sites, okay? So this really, in my opinion, calls into the question of solely relying on build and maintenance as a way to manage fertility. I think we've got more than half the acres in the state are rented ground. Folks might not be interested in investing money to build those soil test levels up. So let's think about not fertilizing to build soil levels, but fertilizing to feed that crop, right? From an economic perspective, I think that makes a lot of sense. Grain yield increases were not consistent and suggest soils have the capacity to supply P and K for years without fertilization. Our Kate Nelson analysis shows somewhere, it's not a perfect number, and it never will be. If we understand agronomy and soil fertility, it's never going to be a perfect number. But somewhere around 20, if you get below that, you have an increased risk of yield loss without fertilization. 20 for phosphorus and 100 for potassium. As a body of work, we have no evidence, folks, no evidence that our tri-state recommendations are too low and need to be raised, right? So I think we can say that with a lot of authority, a lot of certainty, that they don't need to increase, okay? I think from what I've seen in the last 5 years of work, we show that where they're at is a pretty good conservative estimate. And this idea of, again, relying solely on build and maintenance is, I don't know if this is a contentious conclusion statement of it's questionable, but I think that we need to think about it a little bit more flexibly depending on the grower's context. So.